A night of unjustified authority. The day had been long, filled with high-stakes meetings, security briefings, and urgent reports that demanded immediate attention. Elena Moore, the FBI chief, had grown accustomed to the weight of her responsibilities, but even she needed a moment to breathe. Tonight was rare, an evening where she could leave her office before the sky turned completely dark. As she navigated the city streets, she decided to take the scenic route home. The pressure of her role often felt suffocating, and the quiet suburban roads offered a fleeting sense of normalcy. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders as she drove, her hands steady on the wheel. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Price, her deputy director, was calling. Elena, always meticulous, chose to pull over before answering. She spotted an open curb under a dimly lit street lamp and smoothly guided her black sedan to a stop. The moment she picked up the call, she could sense Marcus's usual mix of professionalism and concern. "Chief, you still at the office?" he asked. "No, I'm heading home now. Just pulled over to take this call." "What's up?" she replied. "Nothing urgent, just a heads up. We got the final clearance on that corruption case in the bureau. The investigation starts Monday." "Good," she said, nodding slightly. "We'll go over the details first thing in the morning." As she continued the conversation, her situational awareness never faded. Years of training made her hyper-alert to her surroundings, even in a so-called safe neighborhood. And that's when she noticed it. The faint reflection of flashing blue and red lights in her side mirror. A police cruiser had rolled to a stop behind her. Elena's stomach clenched, but her expression remained unreadable. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was legally parked, engaged in a routine phone call. Yet she knew exactly what this was. She watched as the officer stepped out, a white man, his build solid, his presence exuding the kind of authority that wasn't earned but forcefully taken. Officer Jason Hunt. Elena had encountered his type before. The kind who believed power was an unchecked right. The kind who saw a black woman alone in a nice car and immediately assumed she didn't belong. Hunt's posture was rigid, his movements slow and deliberate as he approached her vehicle, flashlight in hand. He tapped the glass of her window, harder than necessary. "License and registration," he ordered, his tone clipped, indifferent to pleasantries. Elena suppressed a sigh. She didn't need to check her watch to know what time it was. Past midnight, the hour where authority figures believe fewer eyes meant fewer consequences. "Good evening, officer." She greeted him evenly, her hands resting clearly on the wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Hunt didn't even pretend to look at her legally parked car. His gaze never left her face, as if his mere presence alone justified the stop. "Obstructing traffic," he lied smoothly. "Parked illegally in a no-standing zone." Elena's eyes flickered to the curb. Completely legal parking. She could have argued. She had every legal right to. But she had been in this situation before. She knew how these encounters escalated. "I believe this is a legal parking spot," she said, keeping her voice measured as she reached, slowly and deliberately, for her glove compartment. As she retrieved her registration, Hunt's flashlight scanned the interior of her car, as if searching for something to validate his bias. "What are you doing here?" he pressed, his voice dripped with suspicion. Elena's grip on her documents tightened. "Taking a call before heading home," she answered. "This isn't exactly a neighborhood you people drive through often." She knew what he meant. She also knew he wanted a reaction. She gave him nothing. "I'm an FBI agent," she stated plainly, handing over her documents. "My credentials are in my glove compartment if you'd like to verify." Hunt took the papers, his face unreadable. She could see the conflict in his expression, the immediate resistance to accepting that the black woman he had just tried to intimidate held more authority than he did. Instead of acknowledging it, he took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "Step out of the vehicle." Elena's pulse remained steady, but internally she braced herself. This wasn't procedure. There was no cause, But she also knew that refusing would give him an excuse to escalate. "Officer, is there a reason for this request?" "I don't like your attitude," he snapped. She had seen this before. This was about power. He needed to feel in control. A small crowd had started gathering. Residents peeked from their windows, drawn by the flashing lights. A car passing by slowed, a phone visible in the window. Someone was recording. Elena knew this changed the dynamic. Hunt did too. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his belt. The presence of witnesses made him angrier. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered. She complied, moving with a measured grace as she stepped out of the vehicle. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Hunt circled her car, a predator pretending to look for something that wasn't there. His flashlight beamed through her windows. "What's in your trunk?" he demanded. "Nothing illegal," she replied. "Open it." Her patience was wearing thin. "Unless you have probable cause, I believe I have the right to refuse a search." Hunt stepped closer, invading her space, his breath sharp with irritation. "This is my call, not yours," he growled. Elena lifted her chin slightly. "Actually, it's the law's call." Hunt's eyes flickered with something dangerous. She saw it before she felt it. The brief flash of rage before his boot connected with her shin, a sharp, deliberate kick meant to provoke. The pain shot up her leg, but she refused to give him the reaction he wanted. The murmurs from the watching crowd grew louder. The phone recording from the passing car remained steady. And then, the moment of reckoning arrived. A second patrol car pulled up. The door swung open, and a high-ranking officer stepped out, Captain Reed, Hunt's direct superior. His face drained of color as soon as he saw Elena's FBI badge, which had slid slightly from her inner coat pocket during the confrontation. "What the hell is going on here?" Reed barked. Elena met Hunt's eyes. His previous smugness was gone, replaced by dread. The crowd watched silently, sensing the shift in power. She adjusted her suit jacket, stepping forward with the same measured calm she had maintained throughout the encounter. "Officer Hunt here was just explaining why he chose to violate my civil rights and physically assault a federal agent," she said smoothly. Captain Reed turned to Hunt, his face unreadable. Then he pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, I need internal affairs at my location immediately. We have a situation." Hunt's world began to unravel in real time. This was just the beginning. The weight of justice. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, but Elena Moore stood tall, unshaken by the events that had just unfolded. The flashing lights from the patrol cars flickered against the growing crowd of onlookers, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Officer Jason Hunt had taken a step back, his previously rigid demeanor now laced with unease. The realization of what he had done, who he had done it to, was finally sinking in. Elena could see it in his eyes. He knew. He had just assaulted the FBI chief. And there were witnesses. Captain Reed, a seasoned officer with a graying beard and a no-nonsense attitude, had barely taken his eyes off Hunt since stepping out of his patrol car. The air was thick with tension as his voice cut through the silence. "Hunt," he barked. "Step over here. Now." Hunt hesitated. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched. His eyes flickered toward the watching civilians, then to Elena, who still hadn't so much as twitched in response to his earlier aggression. She refused to give him what he wanted. Fear. The only expression she wore was one of calculated control. "Captain," Hunt began, but Reed cut him off with a sharp glare. "I don't want to hear it. Put your weapon on the hood of the patrol car." Hunt stiffened. His hands hovered near his belt, fingers twitching as if tempted to resist. "Now, officer," Reed snapped. The authority in Reed's voice left no room for argument. Hunt exhaled sharply through his nose, but he obeyed. He removed his service pistol from his holster and set it down with an audible clink on the hood of his patrol car. The moment it left his hands, 2 internal affairs officers, recently called to the scene, stepped in. Officer Jason Hunt, you are under investigation for use of excessive force and misconduct, one of them said, his tone neutral but firm. We need you to come with us. The watching crowd broke into hushed murmurs. Elena stood in silence, letting the events play out naturally. She didn't need to intervene. The system, when it worked correctly, was already doing the job. But she also knew that systems had loopholes. And people like Hunt, they existed in those loopholes. Even now, as Hunt was placed in cuffs, not arrested yet, but detained pending an official investigation, Elena could see the way his mind was racing. He wasn't afraid of consequences. He was afraid of losing control. The difference was subtle, but to someone like Elena, someone who had spent her entire career navigating power structures, it was painfully obvious. And that made Hunt even more dangerous. The backlash begins. Elena knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment Hunt was taken away, she stepped into the back of her car and pulled out her phone. Marcus, she said, the tension in her voice evident. We have a problem. I saw the live stream. Marcus Price responded immediately. This is going viral, Chief. Elena's grip on the phone tightened. Live stream, she echoed. Yeah, someone in the crowd was broadcasting the whole thing. It's already hit social media. The public knows Hunt assaulted you before he even knew who you were, and now that he does, he's going to fight back. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. This wasn't just about Hunt anymore. This was about the system, the very system that had allowed men like Hunt to flourish unchecked. She had no doubt that Hunt's allies, and he had them, no doubt about that, were already working behind the scenes to get him out of trouble. Let them fight back, Elena said after a beat. They're going to dig their own graves. The thin blue line. The next morning, Elena walked into FBI headquarters, already knowing what awaited her. News reporters were stationed outside, swarming the building like sharks that had scented blood. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions, and microphones were shoved in her direction. Chief Moore, was the officer targeting you because of your race? Chief Moore, do you believe this is a case of police misconduct? Do you think Officer Hunt should be terminated? Elena didn't stop. She didn't engage. Instead, she strode directly into the building, ignoring the chaos behind her. Once inside, she was greeted by Marcus Price, who was already flipping through a stack of printed reports. Good to see you in one piece, he muttered, handing her a file. Elena took it and skimmed through it quickly. It was worse than she thought. Hunt has a history of complaints, Marcus said, confirming what she was already reading. Excessive force, racial profiling. Had every complaint either disappeared or was dismissed. Elena felt a bitter anger settle in her stomach. Who covered for him? His superior officers, mostly, Marcus answered. But some of them had external pressure. It looks like Hunt had friends in high places. That didn't surprise her. Did Internal Affairs process his suspension yet? She asked. Marcus hesitated. That's the problem. Elena looked up. What problem? Reed sent him in, yeah. But Hunt was released after 4 hours. Elena's jaw clenched. They let him walk. More than that. Marcus placed another folder in front of her. He's already lawyered up, and he's not going down quietly. She flipped it open. The legal statement from Hunt's attorneys was already making its rounds online. Officer Jason Hunt was wrongfully accused and subjected to an unjustified investigation based on a misunderstanding. This is a political move to damage his career and reputation. We will be pursuing legal action for defamation and wrongful detention. Elena closed the folder slowly. Of course, he would paint himself as the victim. Marcus ran a hand down his face. He's not just fighting back, Elena. He's taking this public. His lawyer is already doing interviews, saying you overreacted. That you used your status as FBI chief to have him targeted. And guess what? Elena didn't respond. She already knew the answer. A good chunk of people are believing him, Marcus said flatly. Elena wasn't surprised. Angry, yes, but surprised, no. Hunt knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing into a deeply embedded system of protection and privilege. He wasn't trying to prove his innocence. He was making himself untouchable, and it might have worked. If he had targeted anyone but her. The investigation begins. Elena took a deep breath, forcing her emotions under control. If Hunt wants a war, she said, voice like steel, then we'll give him one. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What's the plan? We dig, she said, flipping the first file shut. If he wants to fight this publicly, then we will too, but not with words. She locked eyes with Marcus. We'll fight him with proof. The silence stretched between them before Marcus nodded. I'll pull everything we have. Complaints, patrol reports, every stop he's ever made. Good, Elena said. And I'll handle his enablers. Because Hunt isn't the only one who's about to go down. A cold determination settled over her. This wasn't just about one racist cop. This was about the system that protected him. And Elena. She was about to tear that system apart. The battle for truth begins. The morning sun streamed through the wide glass windows of FBI headquarters, but there was no warmth in its glow. Elena Moore sat at the long, polished conference table in the Bureau's war room, staring at the digital evidence displayed across the multiple screens on the wall. Every file, every disappeared complaint, every altered report, it was all laid out before her. The weight of it pressed against her like an invisible force, but she would not buckle. This was bigger than Hunt now. It was bigger than one rogue cop. This was systemic, and it wasn't just about exposing it anymore. It was about destroying it. The smear campaign begins. Across town, Jason Hunt was doing exactly what she expected. On the television screens in the war room, his face filled the news channels, seated next to his high-profile attorney in a polished, PR-ready interview. I did my job. That's all, Hunt said, his voice controlled, calm. A perfect act. That woman, Ms. Moore, abused her power to get me suspended because I stopped her for a traffic violation. She escalated the situation, not me. Elena's grip tightened around the edge of the table. Marcus Price, seated beside her, let out a humorless chuckle. Wow, he's really going all in on the innocent act. The reporter interviewing Hunt didn't even challenge him. So you're saying you were unfairly targeted? That's exactly what I'm saying, Hunt responded smoothly. I didn't know who she was at the time. She seemed agitated. Maybe she had something to hide, I don't know. But as an officer, I was doing what I was trained to do, keep the community safe. And now you're facing suspension for doing my job. Hunt sighed, shaking his head. It's political. They don't want cops like me on the force. They want to make an example out of me. And I won't stand for it. The words were calculated, deliberate. He was flipping the script, painting himself as the victim. A good, hard-working officer under attack by the system. And the worst part, it was working. The public backlash was split. Online forums, conservative media outlets, and anti-bureau voices latched onto the story instantly. This is why the FBI shouldn't be interfering with local law enforcement. Another example of the government taking down a cop for doing his job. So if an officer stops an FBI chief, it's suddenly a crime. What a joke. The misinformation spread like wildfire, twisting the truth, turning reality into a battlefield of perception. Marcus dragged a hand down his face. I hate to say it, but if we don't act fast, he's going to turn this into a public sympathy case. Elena's jaw clenched. She knew how these stories played out. Hunt had been on the force for years, long enough to know how to play the game. He was using the brave cop wronged by the system angle, the patriotic defender under attack narrative. And it was dangerous. If he controlled the public narrative, it would be harder to push for actual accountability. She inhaled deeply and straightened in her seat. Then we control the facts. Marcus raised an eyebrow. How? Alina's gaze hardened. We take the fight where it matters most. The Hunt files. Uncovering the truth. The first step was to dissect Hunt's career. The Bureau's data team had already started pulling years' worth of reports, piecing together every case, every traffic stop, every complaint Hunt had ever been involved in. And the results. They were worse than she expected. Marcus placed a thick folder on the table, flipping it open. Inside were neatly organized case summaries, but the sheer volume of them was staggering. In the last 5 years, Hunt has been accused of excessive force 11 times. At least 4 complaints of racial profiling, most from Black or Hispanic civilians, all dismissed by internal affairs. Every single time, his superior officers covered for him. Alina leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. They let him get away with it for years, she murmured. And now he thinks he's untouchable. Marcus scrolled through a set of traffic stop records on the digital screen. He pulled over Black drivers 3 times more than white drivers, even though the demographics in his patrol area don't justify that ratio. Alina's expression remained unreadable. So it wasn't just harassment, she said. It was targeted. Marcus nodded grimly. And here's the kicker. He only issued citations to about 40% of those Black drivers. Alina narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? Marcus tapped on a document. It means those stops weren't about actual traffic violations. It was about control. He pulled them over because he could, because he wanted them to feel powerless. The room fell silent. It wasn't just about Hunt's aggression. It was about his intent. And then there's this, Marcus added, pulling up body cam footage timestamps. His camera was malfunctioning or turned off in 8 different cases involving physical altercations. Alina let out a sharp exhale. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. She stood from her chair, pressing her hands against the table as she looked at Marcus. We need to expose this. How? Marcus asked. We can't release raw case files to the public. That's illegal. Alina's lips curled into a small, dangerous smirk. Then we take it to the people who can. Breaking the story. The next day, Alina arrived at one of the top investigative journalism agencies in the city. She had called in a favor. Jasmine Cole, a veteran journalist known for her hard-hitting exposes, met her in a private office. This is big, Jasmine said after skimming through the files Alina had handed her. You're telling me this guy had all of this swept under the rug? I'm not telling you, Jasmine, Alina said evenly. I'm showing you. Jasmine flipped through the evidence, her expression growing darker with every page. If this is true, then Hunt isn't just another bad cop. He's part of a network of corruption. And that's exactly why he's fighting back so hard, Alina responded. Jasmine sat back, her fingers tapping the desk as she thought. I'll run it, she said finally. I'll need to fact-check everything. But if it all holds up, I'll break the story. Alina nodded. Make sure you hit hard. He's already winning the PR battle. We need the public to see what he really is. Jasmine smiled. Don't worry, Chief Moore. If there's one thing I know how to do, it's burn liars to the ground. The tides begin to turn. Within 24 hours, the first article dropped. EXTLUZIV. Officer Jason Hunt's disturbing record of racial profiling and violence. How the system protected him. It was everywhere. The news cycle exploded. Hunt's public sympathy began to crumble. Public forums shifted. Social media erupted. Wait, this guy has ELEVN complaints against him. They let him get away with this for years. How was he still a cop? The momentum was shifting. But Alina knew this was only the beginning. Because now, the real fight for justice was about to begin. The system strikes back. Alina Moore had been in high-stakes battles before. She had taken down cartels, corporate criminals, and national security threats. But this fight was different. Because this fight wasn't just against one man. It was against an entire system built to protect him. And the system, it was fighting back. The first counterattack. The morning after the expose on Jason Hunt went live, Alina sat in her FBI office, staring at the multiple screens displaying breaking news reports. The backlash had begun. News anchors were already twisting the narrative, shifting the focus away from Hunt's brutal record and turning it into an attack on Alina herself. FBI Chief Moore is clearly using her influence to target law enforcement. Should a federal agent really have the power to dismantle local police forces? If Moore had an issue with Officer Hunt, why didn't she file a complaint through proper channels instead of getting the media involved? This seems like a witch hunt. Alina clenched her jaw. Marcus Price, her deputy, stood beside her, arms crossed as he scrolled through the social media firestorm. "They're trying to turn you into the villain," he muttered. Alina wasn't surprised. This was textbook retaliation. Whenever someone threatened the establishment fought back viciously. She turned to Marcus. "What about the department? Any official response?" Marcus grimaced. "Not great." He pulled up a statement from the police commissioner, a man who had, until now, remained silent. "Officer Hunt is a decorated officer with years of dedicated service. It is deeply concerning that he is being persecuted based on allegations that were never proven. This sets a dangerous precedent for law enforcement everywhere." "Unbelievable," Alina muttered. "They're doubling down." Marcus exhaled sharply. "That's not the worst of it." He slid his phone across the desk. Alina's stomach turned cold as she read the headline. "Breaking. FBI Chief Moore under internal review for overstepping authority." For the first time in the entire investigation, Alina's mask of composure cracked. She looked up at Marcus, disbelief flashing in her dark eyes. "They opened a federal review on me." Marcus's face was tight with anger. "It's a distraction tactic. They're trying to muddy the waters. If they can make it about your bias instead of Hunt's crimes, they think they can discredit you." Alina slammed the file in her hands down on the desk. This wasn't just about protecting Hunt anymore. The entire system was sending her a message. "Back off, or we'll ruin you." The threats escalate. Alina had faced enemies before, but there was something uniquely insidious about fighting corruption from the inside. When she took down criminals, she knew who the enemy was. But here, the threats were coming from within the very system she had sworn to uphold. That evening, as she left the bureau, she felt it immediately. The eyes. Someone was watching her. Alina was trained to read subtle shifts in atmosphere. And right now, everything in her gut screamed danger. She casually reached for her phone but didn't unlock it. Instead, she glanced at the reflection in the tinted glass of the FBI building. A black unmarked SUV sat idling across the street. Too clean. Too still. A surveillance vehicle. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind raced. Someone wanted her to know she was being watched. They weren't hiding. They were sending a message. She turned away, walking calmly toward her car. But inside, she was already planning her next move. The setup. 2 days later, Jason Hunt made his next move. Seated beside his lawyer at a press conference, he stared directly into the camera. "I have spent my entire career serving this city with honor and integrity. I have never targeted anyone based on race, and now I am being framed." Then came the real bombshell. "I have received multiple death threats since this smear campaign began. My family is in danger, and I hold the FBI responsible for putting my life at risk." Alina's hands curled into fists. She was watching a masterful play of manipulation in real time. Hunt was painting himself as the victim, not just of corrupt federal overreach, but now as a target of violence. Marcus let out a string of curses beside her. "This bastard. He's making himself untouchable." Alina didn't respond. Her mind was already moving ahead. This was no longer just about evidence. This was about who controlled the story. And right now, Hunt was winning the PR battle, flipping the game. Elena sat in her office late into the night, staring at the case files on Hunt. Facts didn't matter in a war of perception. Narratives did. And right now, Hunt was controlling the narrative. She needed to flip the game. And she knew exactly how to do it. 48 hours later, the power play. Elena walked into the newsroom of a major news outlet, her posture unwavering. The reporters looked up, stunned. The FBI chief never gave direct interviews. That was about to change. She took a seat across from Jasmine Cole, the journalist who had broken Hunt's story in the first place. The cameras rolled. Elena didn't smile. She looked directly into the camera, her voice calm, sharp as a blade. Let me be clear, Jason Hunt is not a victim. The room went dead silent. I am not coming after police officers. I am coming after corruption. And if Jason Hunt is afraid, it's because he knows exactly what he has done. Jasmine leaned forward. Chief Moore, Hunt claims you are politically targeting him. What do you say to that? Elena's eyes were hard as steel. The real question is, why did the police department protect him for so long? A beat of silence. The journalists exchanged glances. Elena wasn't defensive. She wasn't backpedaling. She was going on the offensive. Why were complaints buried? She continued. Why was his body cam malfunctioning 8 different times? If Hunt wants to claim innocence, then let's investigate him fully, and let's see what the truth really is. Boom. A direct challenge. Jasmine hesitated. So you believe he's guilty? Elena leaned forward slightly. I believe that if the police department had nothing to hide, they wouldn't be fighting this hard to stop me. The camera light blinked red. The interview ended. Elena stood, and she knew she had just flipped the game. The fallout begins. The next day, the media erupted. FBI CHIEF ACCUSDS Police Department of COV Orang up Hunt's Siriamies. Imori to Police COMMISSIONER. NV Stigate him feebly. The system is fighting here, and she's fighting back. The narrative was shifting, and for the first time since this battle began, Jason Hunt was on the defensive. Elena had played her move. Now, she waited to see what the system would do next. Cracks in the foundation. The newsroom interview had done exactly what Elena Moore intended. It forced the system to react. By flipping the script, she made it impossible for the police department to keep shielding Jason Hunt without looking complicit. And just as expected, within 24 hours, the police commissioner was forced to respond. The commissioner's response, a carefully worded lie. The press conference was staged to perfection. Commissioner David Holloway stood at the podium, surrounded by stoic-faced officers. Behind him, an American flag and the police department's emblem were perfectly positioned for the cameras. Elena watched the live feed from her office, already knowing the political game at play. Holloway cleared his throat before speaking in a measured, rehearsed tone. We take allegations of misconduct very seriously. Lie number 1. If they did, Hunt would have been fired years ago. Officer Hunt is a dedicated public servant who has put his life on the line for this city. He is entitled to due process, just like any citizen. Lie number 2. The people he harassed never got due process. They got profiling, intimidation, and bruises. Then came the real kicker. However, in the interest of transparency, we have decided to conduct an internal review of Officer Hunt's past cases. Elena's eyebrow lifted slightly. That wasn't a victory yet. It was a stalling tactic. Marcus Price, standing beside her, huffed in frustration. They're pretending to investigate him just to buy time. Elena nodded. Exactly. They hope the public will forget. They think they can wait this out. But that was their mistake. Elena wasn't going to wait for them to investigate themselves. She was going to force their hand, breaking the thin blue line. Later that night, Elena sat in a quiet diner. across from someone who could end Hunt's career overnight. Detective Lisa Grayson. Grayson had been at the infamous warehouse meeting where Hunt and other officers had been caught discussing destroying evidence and covering their tracks. And now, she was ready to talk. "You understand the risk?" Elena asked, her voice calm but firm. Grayson exhaled, staring at her coffee cup. "Yeah. Once you go on record, they'll come after you." Grayson gave a humorless chuckle. "They already are." She slid a burner phone across the table. Elena picked it up, flipping through messages sent from anonymous numbers. "You better shut your mouth, traitor. We don't protect rats. You think the FBI can save you? Think again." Elena's stomach tightened. "They're trying to scare you into silence." Grayson let out a slow breath. "It won't work." Elena studied her carefully. "Why now? Why talk to me?" Grayson's hands tightened into fists. "Because I signed up to protect people. And what Hunt did, what this whole department is covering up, that's not protecting anyone. It's terrorizing them." For the first time that night, Elena allowed herself to believe Grayson wasn't just looking for an easy way out. She wanted to burn this corruption to the ground. The whistleblower goes public. 2 days later, Detective Lisa Grayson sat across from a live television audience, her face projected on millions of screens across the country. Elena and Marcus watched from the FBI office, knowing this moment would change everything. Grayson took a breath and spoke. "I was part of a system that allowed Jason Hunt to operate without consequences. I saw firsthand how evidence was buried, how complaints were dismissed before they were even investigated." The anchor leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the confession. "Are you saying there was an organized effort to protect him?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "Yes, and not just him. Other officers like him. There was an entire unspoken rule: cover for your own, no matter what." "And did Hunt specifically target black civilians?" Grayson's face darkened. "All the time. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And it wasn't just about stopping them. It was about making them feel powerless." The news anchors exchanged shocked glances. Social media exploded. And within minutes, the police department released a new statement. "Detective Lisa Grayson has been placed on administrative leave pending further review." Elena's hands tightened into fists. "They're punishing her for telling the truth." Marcus exhaled sharply. "What do we do?" Elena's answer was immediate. "We make sure the truth is too big to bury." Forcing the final move, Elena had one last card to play. She walked into the Department of Justice's office, straight into the office of Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Lynn, the one person powerful enough to take this case federal. Rachel looked up from her desk, eyes sharp. "This is big, Elena." Elena nodded. "Bigger than we thought." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "If we take this to a federal level, it means open war with local law enforcement." Elena met her gaze without hesitation. "Then let's go to war." Rachel studied her for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number. "This is Rachel Lynn. We need to talk about opening a federal corruption case in the police department. The system crumbles. The moment the Justice Department got involved, everything changed overnight." A federal corruption case was officially launched. Multiple officers resigned to avoid indictment. Jason Hunt's lawyer suddenly went silent. The police commissioner was forced to cooperate or be charged himself. The entire structure that had protected Hunt for years was now falling apart. And Jason Hunt, he was running out of places to hide. The final arrest. The night before his arrest, Hunt did exactly what Elena expected. He tried to run. But Elena was ahead of him. As he stepped out of his house, FBI agents swarmed him. "Jason Hunt," an agent announced, slapping cuffs on his wrists, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power." The once arrogant officer, who had smirked at her weeks ago, now looked pale and stunned. Elena stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his. "You thought you were untouchable," she said quietly. Hunt's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Elena gave him one last cold look. "You were wrong." As he was shoved into the FBI vehicle, Elena exhaled. This wasn't just about Hunt anymore. It was about the system that had protected him. And now, that system was finally crumbling. For the first time in years, justice wasn't just an idea. It was happening. When the house burns, everyone runs. Jason Hunt's arrest had sent shockwaves through the city, but Elena Moore knew better than to celebrate. The real battle was just beginning. Because when a system like this starts to fall, the people who built it don't go down quietly. And Hunt, he wasn't the top of the chain. He was just the first one to fall. The panic inside the department. The morning after Hunt was booked into federal custody, the police department's headquarters was in chaos. Phones rang nonstop. Lawyers flooded the offices. Officers whispered nervously in the hallways. The internal shields were breaking, and the ones who had protected Hunt for years knew that their own time was running out. Inside the commissioner's office, David Holloway sat with his head in his hands, while his advisors and lawyers argued around him. "This is a disaster," one of them snapped. "If Hunt flips on us, this department is done." "It's worse than that," another said grimly. "They're already looking into our buried complaints. If Moore keeps pushing, she's going to uncover everything. We have to get ahead of this." Commissioner Holloway lifted his head, his face pale. "How?" Silence. Nobody had an answer. For the first time in decades, they were losing control. Jason Hunt's bargain. Meanwhile, inside a high-security FBI holding facility, Jason Hunt sat across from his court-appointed lawyer, his hands cuffed to the table. The arrogance was gone. The moment the federal charges were read to him, he knew they weren't playing games anymore. Obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights, tampering with official records, aggravated assault under color of authority. These weren't state charges. These were federal. He wasn't facing a suspension or a slap on the wrist. He was looking at 20 to 30 years in a federal prison. And that terrified him. His lawyer leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Jason, you need to listen to me. The feds have a rock-solid case. If you don't cooperate, you're going to die in prison." Hunt's face twitched. "You're telling me to rat." His lawyer sighed. "I'm telling you to save yourself. If you help them take down the bigger names, the ones who protected you, you might get a deal." Jason looked away, his jaw clenching. For years, he had been the one in power. Now, the people who used to shield him were pretending they didn't even know his name. He wasn't important to them anymore. He was a liability. And he knew it. Slowly, he exhaled. "Get me a deal," he muttered. The lawyer nodded. "I'll call the U.S. attorney." The betrayal that shook the city. Elena was sitting in her office when Marcus walked in, his expression unreadable. "Guess who just flipped?" he said. Elena looked up sharply. "Hunt." Marcus tossed a file onto her desk. He just agreed to testify against the entire department. He's naming names. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt a flicker of satisfaction. "Who's on the list?" Marcus exhaled sharply, flipping open the file. "It's worse than we thought. He's implicating high-ranking officers, including Commissioner Holloway." Elena's fingers tightened on the desk. "He's going after the commissioner." Marcus nodded grimly. "He says Holloway personally shut down investigations, helped cover up racial profiling cases, and even signed off on fabricated reports." Elena leaned back, her mind racing. Holloway was the head of the department. If Hunt's testimony was strong enough, this wouldn't just be about one corrupt precinct. It would be about an entire leadership structure built on lies. "We need to lock this down," Elena said firmly. "Make sure Hunt doesn't back out or change his story." Marcus smirked. "Oh, he won't. He's too scared of dying in prison." Elena nodded. "Good. Because once we take Holloway down, This whole system is going to fall apart. The police commissioner's last stand. The moment news broke that Hunt was cooperating, Commissioner Holloway panicked. He lawyered up immediately. He called every political contact he had. He even tried to claim that the charges were politically motivated. But it was too late. Alina had anticipated every move he would make. Before he could launch a full-scale defense, she made sure that a sealed indictment was prepared. And the moment it was approved by a grand jury, they moved in. The arrest that shook the city. The day was bright and clear when the FBI arrived at the police department with federal arrest warrants. A swarm of agents, cameras, and stunned officers watched as Commissioner Holloway was escorted out of the building in handcuffs. Alina stood on the steps of the precinct, watching as the once powerful man was shoved into the back of an FBI vehicle. A few months ago, he had stood at a podium, defending Jason Hunt. Now, he was just another criminal, and he knew it. The fallout. The arrests of Hunt, Holloway, and several senior officers sparked national headlines. Major police corruption scandal rocks the city. FBI crackdown exposes years of systemic abuse. Federal charges filed against law enforcement leadership. The police union tried to push back, but the public pressure was too strong. The city's mayor was forced to announce sweeping reforms. Internal affairs was gutted and rebuilt from the ground up. Several officers resigned before they could be investigated. And for the first time in years, the people who had been silenced for so long, they were finally being heard. Alina's reflection. Days later, Alina stood in front of her office window, watching the city move on. The fight wasn't over. The system wasn't fixed overnight, but it had begun to crack. And cracks turn into breaks. Marcus entered, holding 2 coffee cups. "You did it, Chief." Alina turned to him, lips curving slightly. "We did it." She took the coffee, taking a slow sip. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt real. And that was worth everything. The reckoning and the road ahead. The city had changed. Not overnight, not completely. But something irreversible had happened. The system had been cracked wide open, and there was no closing it back up. For the first time in decades, the people in power were the ones afraid. And Alina Moore. She was just getting started. The trial of the century, the case against Jason Hunt, Commissioner Holloway, and the corrupt network within the police department was the most high-profile trial in the city's history. Courtrooms overflowed with reporters, protesters, and citizens who had spent years being silenced. The first day of trial, Hunt refused to look at Alina as he was escorted into the courthouse, his once smug expression replaced with thinly veiled fear. Marcus Price, standing beside Alina, smirked. Looks like reality finally caught up with him. Alina didn't respond, her eyes locked onto the man who had started it all. Hunt. The last time she had stood across from him, he had kicked her, tried to humiliate her, and expected to walk away untouched. Now, he was shackled, wearing an orange jumpsuit, and sitting behind bulletproof glass, a fallen king in his own world. And Alina, she was the one who put him there, the testimony that broke everything. The case was overwhelming. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Lynn, laid out Hunt's years of abuse, Holloway's cover-ups, and the entire system that had allowed them to operate unchecked. But the moment that shattered the courtroom came when Detective Lisa Grayson took the stand. The room fell silent as she looked out over the sea of faces, officers she had once called colleagues, the families of those Hunt had terrorized, and the city that had once trusted the badge without question. She took a deep breath and spoke. "I was part of the system that protected Jason Hunt. I saw complaints buried, victims ignored, and officers rewarded for targeting Black and Hispanic civilians." She paused, her voice steady. "We weren't enforcing the law. We were enforcing fear." The courtroom murmured, the weight of her words settling like a storm cloud over the room. The defense lawyer leaned forward. "Detective Grayson, Why did you never come forward until now? Lisa's jaw tightened. Because I was scared. The lawyer smirked, thinking he had caught her. And now you're not. Lisa turned, locking eyes with Jason Hunt across the room. No. Because now I know that fear is how they keep us silent. And I won't be silent anymore. The entire room erupted. It was over. The jury had already made up their minds. The verdict. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The deliberation lasted less than 6 hours. The verdict was announced in a courtroom so packed with people that security had to block the doors. Jason Hunt was found guilty on all counts. Commissioner Holloway was sentenced to 25 years. And the entire police department was forced into federal oversight. For the first time in the city's history, the badge no longer meant immunity. And the people who had suffered the most under it, they finally had justice. The fallout. The days that followed were chaotic. Half the police department resigned before they could be investigated. The city's mayor was forced to hold a press conference admitting failure. The Justice Department announced sweeping reforms. The nation watched, stunned. And Alina Moore. She was right in the center of it. The media wanted interviews. The police department wanted her gone. And the public. They wanted more accountability. The threats don't stop. Alina knew that winning one battle didn't mean the war was over. The day after the verdict, she found a letter on her desk. No name, no return address. Inside, a single note. You made a mistake. You think this is over. It's not. Marcus read it and let out a long, slow sigh. Jesus, these people really don't know when to quit. Alina folded the letter, tossing it into a file with several others just like it. They're scared. Let them be scared. She had spent her entire career fighting against the shadows of corruption. Now, the shadows were afraid of her. And she liked it that way. A city rebuilt. Months passed. Hunt's conviction remained firm. The police department was forced to reform from the inside out. Community leaders were given seats at the table, and new laws were passed to prevent another Hunt from rising. And for the first time in years, the people of this city weren't afraid to call for help. They weren't afraid of who would show up in uniform. Because for the first time, the city was theirs again. Alina's final move. 1 year after Hunt's arrest, Alina sat at her desk, a resignation letter in front of her. Marcus stood in the doorway. You sure about this? Alina looked at him, smiling slightly. I did what I came to do. Now it's time for the next fight. Marcus laughed. You don't know how to rest, do you? Alina smirked. Never. She picked up the letter, signed her name, and placed it in a folder. She wasn't walking away from justice. She was taking the fight to an even bigger stage. Because the war was far from over. And she wasn't done burning down the old system. Not yet.